The Russian invasion of Ukraine is so historically complex that there is no clear, simple political solution. Or is there?
I'm not supporting of Russian military action, and I do think there has to be a peace process, and there has to be a process of demilitarization of the Ukraine and sticking to the original non-nuclear agreement. But I'd also say this: the hypocrisy of the West is unbelievable on this. Where was the legality in the war in Iraq? Where was the legality of so many of the other interventions that have been made elsewhere? And if one reads very carefully what all the Ukrainian forces are saying, yes, there is a very nasty far-right force in Ukraine at the present time, which is part of the government. There is also a more liberal grouping in the Ukraine. There is also a very large Russian grouping in the Ukraine who obviously have some loyalties towards Russia. Does the Ukraine break up? That's a matter for the Ukrainian people. But the idea that we should move the whole thing in rhetoric towards some kind of military war against Russia seems to me an absolute disaster. I think the wider issue is that the EU has got very close to NATO. NATO has been pushing very hard to expand eastwards. Inevitably, Russia is going to get very nervous if NATO sets up bases all around its borders. That in turn encourages Russian militarism. Can't we go back to the point where Ukraine was a nuclear-free country and start to demilitarize and de-escalate the situation and allow a proper debate, much longer than a week, for people to decide their own future in the Ukraine? And it seems to me there's a terrible danger of a rush to a combination of an economic and a military war, and goodness knows what the consequence of that will be. I'm quite alarmed by the way in which the NATO General Secretary seems to be ramping up the ante all the time. It's not his job to go around promoting wars. He's meant to be answerable to a number of different governments. He appears to be behaving as though he's some free agent who could say and do what he likes and develop this very, very dangerous scenario. Ukraine has been the war ground of Europe for 2 centuries. Millions have died in Ukraine from famine, from war, from occupation and from disasters. Let's not visit that upon them again. Let's try and de-escalate, demilitarize and bring about some kind of dialogue and peace process which will guarantee a peaceful future for those people. And I'm not sure that the Russian people, having lost so many in Afghanistan in the past, want to see Russian lives lost in the Ukraine any more than people in this country want to see us going into some ludicrous, futile war. Let's start from the point of a political settlement, not start from the point of building up armed forces, moving fighter jets to Poland, mobilizing the fleet and all these kind of things, negotiate through. And secondly, last point, the West has no moral authority whatsoever to lecture on this. After drone strikes, after Iraq, after so many other internal coups and conflicts around the world, surely hand the thing back to the UN to try to bring about some kind of peace process and de-escalate the rhetoric which is in danger of plunging us into a catastrophic war with nuclear implications.
Thank you. Now, I had Yanis Varoufakis, former leader of Syriza, on my podcast Under the Skin, a Luminary original. The full podcast will be available to you on March the 12th. I asked him to break down for me, as a politician, as a person who sat before the EU, as a person who's seen firsthand the nature of corruption that goes on in the elite rarefied areas of geopolitics, what he thought was the solution to this complex problem. You'll really enjoy hearing him talk about it, because for me he captures some of the moral priorities and some of the political solutions, i.e. emphasis always being with Ukrainian people and the challenge they're facing as an invaded nation, but how we can best understand the history and what possible solutions might be available and the nature of compromise. I think sometimes, I know I do this in my private life, and I bet I do it in the abstract when I'm thinking about stuff that I can't even directly affect. I hold on to the idea of perfection when holding on to perfection actually is preventing a solution. I wonder if you do that in your own life as well. Look in the comments below.
First things first, when there's an invasion, we must always take the side of the people who are facing troops with direct orders to violate their homes, to bombard their neighborhoods, to destroy the circumstances of their lives. And I say that without any hesitation and unconditionally. This is not something that our Western rulers do. I say this regarding the Ukrainians. When I see Ukrainians in Kharkiv, for instance, putting together Molotov cocktails by which to defend their homes from the advancing Russian tanks, I applaud them. But our rulers applaud them while at the same time, when there is a 15-year-old kid in Kalkidia in the Palestinian territories throwing a stone at an advancing bulldozer with the intent to demolish his home, they call him a terrorist. So we make no such distinctions. We support the defenders of their homes, of their neighborhoods, of their communities. So today we stand with Ukraine. Unconditional. No ifs, no buts, no conditionalities attached. To help Ukrainians at this very moment in time, we need to apply the same moral compass universally, making the distinctions between fashionable, deserving victims in the Ukraine and unfashionable victims in Yemen, where only 48 hours ago, I don't know whether you noticed that, Russell, or our viewers noticed it, there were 37 sorties by Saudi Arabian bombers taking out civilians in Yemen. Not in the news, unfashionable victims, who cares about them? My simple point is that to support the Ukrainian victims of Russian aggression, you have to support the Yemen victims of Saudi aggression. If you don't do that, then this is the greatest gift to Putin. Because he says, okay, well, your fashionable victims are unfashionable in Moscow. I don't give a damn about them. And then you enter a relativizing narrative regarding which victims are deserving and which ones are undeserving. Moving on to something else you said, which is a crucial point. Let's forget about our little ideologies at the moment. When there are people who are dying, their circumstances, their situation must prevail and must trump our own political projects, whether it is my political project, your political project, or NATO's political project. So the question now is, how do you stop the carnage? How do we get the Russian troops to withdraw back to their bases? And how do the Ukrainians get a chance to fight it out amongst each other, not with weapons, but with the power of arguments between the leftists and the rightists, between the communists in the Ukraine and the Nazis? And there are Nazis in Ukraine. This is not a reason to bomb Ukraine. In this country, in my country, at some point, the Nazi organization called Golden Dawn was the third largest party. So what? You bomb Greece because we have the serpent's egg hatching in our midst? No. What you do is you create the circumstances for democratic politics in Greece, in the Ukraine, in Yemen, to fight, Islamist fundamentalism, Nazism, fascism, Boris Johnson, whatever. So how do we get the Russian troops out of there? NATO is not proposing to invade, and that's a good thing, because if NATO invaded now, in support of the Ukrainians, we would have Third World War, and climate change wouldn't get a chance. We would have destroyed the planet before climate change was completed. But we, from where we are, from the comfort of our own home or studio or whatever, we have a moral imperative to try to find a solution that we could sell to Putin, that saves all these tens of or hundreds of thousands of people in the Ukraine and gives them a chance to breathe and a chance for democracy and a chance for independence. Now, the question is, is there anything that Putin would buy as part of such a deal? And I think there is. I think that Putin is ruthless and a killer and a war criminal, Chechnya, right? But he's not dumb. He's a highly trained strategist for the KGB. He knows that he cannot occupy the Ukraine forever. He knows that he's going to have something worse than Vietnam in his hands. He knows that the Russian economy is smaller than the economy of Texas, by the way, in terms of gross domestic product. Don't know whether you knew that. Smaller than the economy of Texas. Yeah. He doesn't have the funds to continue. He has the funds to continue to do a lot of damage to the Ukrainians, okay, to destroy a whole generation. But he cannot hold Ukraine. and he cannot hold Russia if he continues, along the lines of a modern Afghanistan for 5, 6, 7, 8 years. So he's looking for a way out. And even if he's not looking for a way out today, he will be looking for a way out next week. And what is this way out that we can offer him, which is consistent with the interests of the Ukrainians and the rest of the world? Imagine if there was an offer by President Biden, because the European Union doesn't count. They're just the lackeys of the US. I mean, and we don't have a leadership in the European Union anyway. But Biden could hold a summit with Putin, and a quid pro quo could emerge. The quid pro quo being very simple: Russia withdraws from Ukraine. There is an agreement for the demilitarization of Donbass and the region around the borders between Ukraine and Russia. There can be some bargaining regarding particular plots of land, Crimea and so on. And both Russia and the United States guarantee the neutrality and independence of Ukraine. Anybody who says that's giving in to Putin will have to answer, what is the alternative? The alternative is carnage, a prolonged occupation, the permanent division of the Ukraine in the long run, and the toxification of politics both in the Ukraine and in Russia.
Let's talk about the UK first, and we could pick any European country, including Germany and France as well. The Russians don't want to negotiate with the Germans, they don't want to negotiate with the French, and they don't want to negotiate with the British, because they understand full well that the United States runs the show. And the British will do what the United States asks them to do. So you could have perfunctory conversations with the British, but it really doesn't matter. And that's why the Russians want to talk to the United States. And the Russians don't even want to talk to NATO. They don't want to talk to Stoltenberg. They want to talk to the United States. They want to talk to Joe Biden, because they know that the Europeans basically do what the Americans ask them to do. And if there's any country that does what the Americans ask them to do almost axiomatically, it's Britain. The Germans and the French sometimes resist, as we know from the Iraq War in 2003. But Tony Blair was a mere cheerleader for the United States in that war. So Britain does not have much of a role to play here. The United States is the key player. I don't say that because I'm an American. And indeed, I think American policy is usually so foolish these days that it would be better if the United States had less influence. And it would be better if the Europeans, especially the Germans and the French, stood up to the Americans. So the EU does matter here. There's no question about that. But the EU is, again, not much of a player. NATO's not much of a player. It's the United States that is driving this train. And let me make one more point on that before I talk about the UN. It's very important to understand that at the April 2008 Bucharest summit, Germany and France were adamantly opposed to any movement to make Ukraine a member of NATO. Because Germany, and here we're talking about Angela Merkel, much to her credit, understood that this was asking for serious trouble. But it was the Americans who, as always, prevailed. And at the end of the Bucharest summit, a statement was issued at the Americans' insistence that said that Ukraine and Georgia would become members of NATO. So the Europeans, and here we're talking about the French and the Germans, they understood that this was a foolish thing to do, but they failed to stand up to the Americans, as is so often the case with the Europeans. Now, finally, you ask about the UN. the UN is effectively useless. And for one very simple reason, the Russians have a veto, right? Anytime there's a dispute between countries that have a vote on the Security Council, and this obviously includes Russia and the United States, the UN is not going to be very meaningful, simply because the Russians would veto anything that they didn't like, and the Americans would veto anything that they didn't like. So this is, bottom line, a problem that has to be solved by the United States and the Russians. We, in 2008, when we were the Unipol, we decided to expand NATO. And it blew up in our face in 2014. This is when the unipolar moment is coming to an end. And the problem continues to linger. And we cannot figure out how to solve it without saying that Ukraine will not become part of NATO. And that's politically unacceptable in the West, especially after you've told the story year after year that the Russians are the bad guys and we're the good guys. If the Russians are the bad guys and they're highly aggressive, and you believe the Ukrainians have the right to this and the right to that, and you're committed to making sure that they realize these rights, it's almost impossible politically to walk away from this one. It's really quite remarkable. And you want to understand that the United States has a deep-seated interest in pivoting to Asia. The United States faces a peer competitor in China. Russia is not a peer competitor. The idea that Russia is some meaningful threat to dominate Europe is a laughable argument, right? Right. You want to understand, we have led the Ukrainian people down the primrose path. They are the ones who are suffering the most as a result of these foolish policies that we pursued during the unipolar moment regarding Russia and Ukraine. And it's now blown up in our face. But to get to the issue that you're raising, I think there's no question that in unipolarity, the United States is free to pursue all sorts of foolish policies because it doesn't pay a great price. It's usually other countries that pay for America's mistakes. And Russia, as I said, has no interest in conquering Ukraine and doesn't have to worry much about Ukraine for strategic reasons in the absence of NATO expansion. So you take NATO expansion away, Ukraine can easily remain a buffer state.
Meanwhile, the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, who before this conflict began had been very upbeat and enthusiastic about joining the NATO military alliance. But on Friday, he lashed out at the NATO military alliance after NATO rejected Ukraine's request to impose a no-fly zone to halt Russia's missile strikes. Now, NATO cited further aggression behind this decision. However, NATO has warned the Russian President Vladimir Putin of fresh sanctions if he does not stop the war. Now, Zelensky has accused the alliance of holding a very weak and a very confused summit in the stand that it has taken against Russia so far.
Сьогодні відбувся саміт НАТО. Слабкий саміт, розгублений саміт. Саміт, на якому видно, що не всі вважають боротьбу за свободу для Європи метою номер один. 9 днів ми бачимо жорстку війну. Руйнують наші міста, обстрілюють наших людей, наших дітей, житлові квартали, церкви, школи, знищують все, що забезпечує нормальне життя, людське життя. І хочуть це продовжувати, знаючи, що нові удари і жертви неминучі. НАТО свідомо ухвалили рішення не закривати небо над Україною.
So let's tell you why Ukraine is asking for a no-fly zone. Remember, Ukraine has in many ways gotten to this conflict because of its desire to join the NATO military alliance. It was in fact led up to it by the NATO. A no-fly zone refers to an airspace where aircrafts of a certain nation cannot fly. No-fly zones are used to protect sensitive or VIP areas, and these include royal residences, sporting events or large gatherings. Militarily, a no-fly zone is meant to stop enemy aircraft. This could, of course, use surveillance, preemptive strikes or shooting at the enemy aircraft. And for NATO, a no-fly zone over Ukraine would effectively mean a direct conflict with Russia in terms of air power. And this is something that the West at this point of time simply cannot afford, because the Russian Air Force is in many ways as good as that the NATO has. For Western countries, any conflict with Russia possibly equals a nuclear war, especially after the Russian president has placed his nuclear forces on high alert.
И будут ли призываться срочники на территории Украины?
Значит, вот очень много из того, что происходит, из того, что сейчас мы видим и с чем мы сталкиваемся, это, безусловно, способы ведения борьбы с Россией. Кстати говоря, те санкции, которые вводятся, они сродни объявлению войны. Но, слава богу, пока до этого не дошло, я думаю, что понимание того, чем это чревато и чем это грозит для всех, у наших так называемых партнеров, в кавычках, все-таки присутствует, несмотря на их безрассудные заявления, вот как это было сделано министром иностранных дел Великобритании, когда она ляпнула, что НАТО может быть вовлечено в конфликт. И нам пришлось сразу же принять решение о приведении в повышенную, в особый режим несения дежурства наших сил сдерживания. Но реакция последовала, сказали, что ничего такого не имелось в виду, но никто же ее не одернул, женщина, министр иностранных дел. Никто не дезавуировал эти заявления. Ну, хоть кто-нибудь на этот счет сказал бы нам, вы знаете, это ее личное мнение, не обращайте внимания. Никто ничего. А мы-то что должны по этому поводу думать? Ну, что нам думать на этот счет? Конечно, мы восприняли это как сигнал. Отреагировали соответствующим образом. Значит, теперь на ваш вопрос непосредственно, значит, по такой и необходимости сегодня. Значит, да, мы видим, что, как я уже сказал, предпринимаются попытки у нас общество раскачать. Кстати говоря, вот тоже подтверждение моих слов о том, что мы имеем дело не просто с радикалами, а с неонацистами. Вот теперь по поводу... Да, по поводу военного положения. Повторяю еще раз, вводятся случаи внешней агрессии, военной угрозы. Надеюсь, такого не произойдет, несмотря на безответственные заявления некоторых должностных лиц. Сейчас мы слышим, что нужно сделать бесполетную зону на территории Украины. Сделать это невозможно на самой территории Украины. Можно только с территории каких-то соседних государств. Но любое движение в этом направлении будет нами рассматриваться как участие в вооруженном конфликте той страны, с территории которой будут создаваться угрозы для наших военнослужащих. Мы в эту же секунду будем рассматривать их как участниками военного конфликта. И уже все равно, какими там членами они являются. Членами, извините, каких организаций. Вот. Значит, поэтому, надеюсь, понимание этого есть, и до этого тоже не дойдет. Значит, кстати говоря, и по ходу самой операции могу сказать много всяких, я знаю, домыслов, правда, мне особенно некогда с этим знакомиться, но так докладывают, что много всяких разговоров по поводу того, что и как идет. Ну, все аналитики видят, что происходит, поэтому никакого секрета я вам здесь не раскрою. Можно было бы действовать по-разному, можно было просто на линии, это, кстати, отчасти ответ на ваш вопрос, можно было просто помогать республикам Донбасса прямо на линии соприкосновения, ну, на фронте, что называется, и просто армии нашей российской подкрепить их. Ну, в этом случае, с той стороны, имея в виду безоглядную поддержку со стороны Запада, значит, националистов и радикалов, с той стороны, бесконечно шла бы поддержка материальными ресурсами, боеприпасами, техникой и так далее. Поэтому наш генеральный штаб, Министерство обороны пошли другим путем. первое, что сделали, уничтожили всю военную инфраструктуру. Ну, не всю, но частично в основном. Склады с вооружением, боеприпасами, авиацию, системы ПВО. Системы ПВО, их устранение требует определенного времени, их нужно, вы люди мирные, но все-таки к авиации имеете отношение, их нужно вскрыть, потом поразить. Практически эта работа завершена. Вот отсюда и требование закрыть небо, но это требование, реализация этого требования сопряжено с колоссальными и катастрофическими последствиями не только для Европы, но и для всего мира. Я думаю, что понимание этого у тех, кто на той стороне что-то там маркует, есть. Вот. Поэтому вот пошли вот этим путем, абсолютно правильно, как оказалось. И спокойно наши военнослужащие работают, делают все для того, чтобы обеспечить безопасность мирного населения. Но, к сожалению, эти бандиты и неонацисты людей не жалеют. Расстреливают даже своих военнослужащих, которые не хотят оказывать вооруженное сопротивление. Такие факты у нас тоже есть. Националисты, эти бандеровцы, эти неонацисты, по-другому не назвать, расстреливают своих военнослужащих. Там почти в каждую такую более-менее часть внедрены вот эти националисты, по несколько десятков человек. И действуют именно таким жестоким образом. Но, повторяю, не призывников, не тех, кто призывается на сборы, мы никого не используем и не собираемся использовать при проведении этой военной операции. И исхожу из того, что наша армия решит все стоящие перед ней задачи. Ни на секунду в этом не сомневаюсь. Об этом говорит весь ход операции. Она идет просто по плану, вот по графику. Все делается так, как и запланировал Генеральный штаб.
Our top focus at this hour. Russian demand for Ukrainian neutrality has been a key issue for Moscow at conflict. Negotiations, and now Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has said that the war-hit country is prepared to consider declaring neutrality. Zelensky said that as part of a peace deal with Russia, Ukraine is prepared to discuss adopting a neutral status. However, such a pact would have to be guaranteed by third parties and put to a referendum. Listen in.
Гарантии безопасности и нейтралитет, безъядерный статус нашего государства, мы готовы на него идти. Это самый главный пункт. Это был первый принципиальный пункт для Российской Федерации, насколько я помню. И насколько мне помнится, что они из-за этого начали войну.
Now, Zelensky made the statement while addressing independent Russian news media. He further added that Ukraine is ready to go for security guarantees, neutrality, as well as a non-nuclear status. However, he demanded that in order to find an agreement to end the conflict, Russian President Vladimir Putin would have to meet him face to face.
Поэтому этот пункт гарантии безопасности для Украины, а так как они говорят, это и для них, он понятен мне, его обсуждают, он глубоко проработан, но меня там интересует, чтобы это не были, знаете, как еще одна бумажка а-ля Будапештский меморандум и так далее. Поэтому нас интересует, чтобы эта бумага превратилась в серьезный договор.
Now, earlier this month, the Kremlin had said Sweden and Austria offered models of neutrality and that Ukraine could adopt those models to help end Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Ukraine had rejected the proposal. It had said that only Kiev could design a system that would be acceptable to Ukrainians. Now, under international law, neutrality means the obligation of a state not to interfere in military conflicts of third states. The obligation that is brought about by unilateral declaration for coercion. Now, at the start of the crisis, Putin demanded that NATO guarantee non-membership for Ukraine. Negotiations have focused on Ukraine staying out of NATO, disarmament and security guarantees. While Ukraine is no longer insisting on NATO membership, Zelensky has refused to discuss the Russian demand for demilitarization of the country. to end more than a month of fighting in Ukraine. The next in-person negotiations between the two sides will take place in Turkey on March 28th till 30th.
Russia withdraws from Ukraine. There is an agreement for the demilitarization of Donbass and the region around the borders between Ukraine and Russia. There can be some bargaining regarding particular plots of land, Crimea and so on. And both Russia and the United States guarantee the neutrality and independence of Ukraine.
Almost every nation has invested enormous amount of money in building and stockpiling arms, armaments, bombs, missiles.
So all of us as people, were we all thinking all these bombs are being kept for entertainment, for display, or it's artwork? What did you think? One day it will be used. The question is on whom. Wars are almost inevitable because economies are built on war.
So we have no intent of stopping the war. Let's be clear about that. When it happens to us, we will cry. When it's happening somewhere else, it's drama. This inhuman attitude towards war and to killing and the suffering that other people go through, we must come out of that. Because most evil things have happened not necessarily because of evil intentions, simply apathy. You sleep through life. That is what is happening to the world, both in terms of soil and in terms of war. We sleep through. After World War II, we formed League of Nations. We made United Nations. The idea was never again such wars will happen, right? Since then, how many wars? Actually, if you look at it, there's not been a single day's break on this planet after World War II without at least a battle going on somewhere. We're not saying we are not in such a la-la land that we don't have any issues. We have issues. But this is the idea of setting up a platform which would solve problems. We pushed it to the side and doing what we want.
So how do we wake up?
First thing is, within your hearts, your anger and hatred must go. I must tell you this.
А вы, в свою очередь, вешаете своему населению. И люди не чувствуют опасности. Вот меня что беспокоит. Ну как мы не можем понять? Мы тащим мир вообще в совершенно новое измерение. Вот в чем проблема. Делают вид, что как будто ничего не происходит. Но я не знаю даже, как достучаться.
And I say this, our country's in trouble. Something has to happen. And if it doesn't happen, and if we don't have smart leadership, you're going to end up with no world. The world is going to be blown to pieces. We have stupid people now running our country. The world is going to be blown to pieces.
What are you thinking about? If the nuclear bomb were to explode right now, what would you choose? Live or die? Live? Yeah, because if I died, then there would be a lot of things I couldn't do anymore. I'd never see my family again. I'd miss the sun on my face. I'd never eat my favourite food again. Never travel. Never be in love. I wouldn't live. What about you? What would you choose? Live or die?
Die. Because if I survive, I wouldn't be able to do a lot of things anymore.
I'd never see my family again. I'd miss the sun on my face. I'd never taste my favourite food again. Never travel. Never be in love.
I wouldn't
live.
The United Nations was founded so that we would never forget the crimes of great power. Are we now in danger of forgetting? Do we forget the lies that justified the conquest of Iraq and disguised America's plans to dominate all the world? And do we accept a distortion of intellect and morality that empties noble words like democracy and liberation of their true meaning, that says it's wrong for a terrorist to kill innocent people, but right for governments to commit the same crimes in our name? The answer is that we need not accept any of this if we recognize that there are now two superpowers. One is the regime in Washington, the other is public opinion, now stirring all over the world, perhaps as never before. Make no mistake, it's an epic struggle. The alternative is not just the conquest of faraway countries, it's the conquest of us, of our minds, our humanity, and our self-respect. If we remain silent, victory over us is assured.
Don't buy into the shadow's dream. Wake up, recreate yourself anew. You are the one you have been waiting for.
Are you ready to win?